The year was 399 BCE. Athens was a city in turmoil. The golden age of Pericles was long gone. The Peloponnesian War had left deep scars. And now a trial was about to begin. A trial that would shake the very foundations of Athenian democracy. The accused, none other than Socrates, the barefoot philosopher. Picture the scene, if you will. The Athenian law court packed to the rafters, the air thick with tension. Whispers and murmurs ripple through the crowd. All eyes are fixed on one man. He stands alone, defiant. This is Socrates, aged 70, facing charges that could cost him his life. The outcome would determine not just Socrates' fate, but the future of Athens itself. The accusations against Socrates were threefold. First, he was charged with impiety. The prosecution claimed he did not believe in the gods of the state. They accused him of introducing new deities. This was a serious charge in ancient Athens. Religion and state were deeply intertwined. To question the gods was to question the very fabric of society. Secondly, Socrates stood accused of corrupting the youth. His accusers claimed he taught young people to question authority, to challenge traditional beliefs, to think for themselves. In the eyes of the conservative elite, this was dangerous. It threatened the established order. The third charge was more political in nature. Socrates was associated with figures who had fallen out of favor. The trial of Socrates was not just about law, it was about power. Socrates' defense was unlike anything the court had ever seen. He did not grovel, he did not plead for mercy. Instead, he stood tall and proud. He spoke with the confidence of a man who knew he was right. His words were not those of a defendant, but of a teacher. Even now facing death, he sought to educate his accusers. He began by addressing the charge of corrupting the youth. If I corrupt the young, he asked, why do none of them accuse me? He pointed out that many of his former students were present in the court. None had come forward to testify against him. Instead, they and their families stood in his support. This, he argued, was proof of his innocence. On the charge of impiety, Socrates was equally defiant. He claimed that far from disbelieving in the gods, he was on a divine mission. As the trial progressed, the city of Athens held its breath. This was no ordinary legal proceeding, it was a spectacle, a drama playing out in real time. The streets buzzed with gossip and speculation. Every word spoken in the courtroom was dissected and debated in the agora, the marketplace of ideas. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The jury, composed of 500 Athenian citizens, listened intently. Some were swayed by Socrates' eloquence, others remained skeptical. The prosecution pressed their case relentlessly. They painted Socrates as a dangerous radical, a threat to the very foundations of Athenian society. Section 5. The verdict that echoed through time. The moment of truth had arrived. The jury filed back into the courtroom. A hush fell over the assembled crowd. The verdict was announced. Guilty. Socrates had been convicted by a narrow margin. The philosopher received the news with characteristic calm, but for his supporters it was a devastating blow. Yet the drama was far from over. In Athenian law, a convicted man could propose his own penalty as an alternative to the prosecution's demand. The prosecution had called for the death penalty. Now it was Socrates' turn to speak. What he said next would shock everyone present. With the verdict delivered, Socrates was led away to prison, his fate sealed by the very city he had served. But even now, facing imminent death, he remained true to his principles, unwavering in his commitment to the pursuit of truth and wisdom. He spent his final days in philosophical discussions with his friends and students, imparting his wisdom and engaging in deep, meaningful conversations. He showed no fear, no regret, only a serene acceptance of his fate. Instead, he saw his impending death as the ultimate test of his teachings, a final opportunity to demonstrate the strength of his convictions. Plato, his most famous student, recorded these final conversations with great care and reverence. They would later become some of the most influential texts in Western philosophy, shaping the thoughts and ideas of countless generations. In them, Socrates explores the nature of the soul, the meaning of justice, and the purpose of life, leaving behind a legacy of profound insights. Even at the end, he was still teaching, still questioning, still seeking wisdom, embodying the very essence of a true philosopher. Many of Socrates' friends urged him to escape, desperate to save him from his unjust fate. They had bribed the guards and made arrangements for his escape, but Socrates refused, standing firm in his beliefs. He argued that to flee would be to admit guilt, a betrayal of his lifelong commitment to truth and justice. It would undermine everything he had stood for, everything he had taught. He had lived by the laws of Athens, he said, and he would die by them too, remaining true to his principles until the very end. Section 7, The Hemlock Cup, Socrates' Last Moments. The day of execution dawned. Socrates' cell was crowded with friends and students. They'd come to say their final goodbyes. The atmosphere was heavy with grief. But Socrates remained calm. He spoke of death not as an end, but as a beginning. A journey to be embraced, not feared. The jailer arrived with the cup of hemlock. He apologized to Socrates, calling him the noblest man he had ever met. Socrates took the cup without hesitation. His friends broke down in tears, but Socrates chided them gently. With steady hands, Socrates raised the cup to his lips. He drank the poison in one draught. Section 8, Plato's Grief and the Birth of Western Philosophy. In the aftermath of Socrates' death, Athens was a city in shock, grappling with the loss of one of its most provocative and influential thinkers. Many who had voted for his execution now felt remorse, realizing the gravity of their decision. But for one man in particular, the loss was devastating, a personal and intellectual catastrophe. Plato, Socrates' most brilliant student, was grief-stricken, overwhelmed by the void left by his mentor's death. He had witnessed the death of not just his teacher, but his hero, his intellectual father, a guiding light in his philosophical journey. Plato's response to this tragedy would change the course of Western thought. He began to write, pouring his grief and wisdom onto parchment. He recorded Socrates' teachings, his method of questioning, his unwavering pursuit of truth. But Plato went further, delving deeper into the realms of philosophy. He developed these ideas, expanded on them, and created new concepts that would resonate through the ages. He created a philosophical system that would dominate Western thought for centuries, influencing countless generations of thinkers. In his most famous work, The Republic, Plato imagined a perfect society ruled by philosopher kings, a vision of justice and wisdom. This was his response to the injustice he had witnessed in Athens, a city that had condemned his beloved teacher. If only the wisest ruled, he argued, tragedies like the execution of Socrates could be avoided and a more just society could be achieved. Section 9, The Ripple Effect, Socrates' Influence on Future Thinkers. The influence of Socrates did not end with Plato. It rippled outwards through time and space, touching countless minds across the centuries. The Stoics, for instance, took Socrates as their model of the ideal sage. They admired his self-control, his indifference to material comforts, his courage in the face of death. The Christian philosophers of the Middle Ages found in Socrates a pagan forerunner of their own faith. They saw parallels between his death and that of Jesus Christ. Both, they argued, were martyrs to the truth. In the Renaissance, Socrates became a symbol of free thought and individual conscience. Even in the modern era, Socrates' influence continues to be felt. Today, Socrates is still revered as the father of Western philosophy. Section 10. The Socratic Method, a legacy that lives on. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of Socrates is his method of inquiry, a technique that has transcended time and geography. The Socratic method, as it came to be known, is a form of dialogue in which a series of questions are used to stimulate critical thinking and illuminate ideas. It's a way of exposing the underlying assumptions in a person's beliefs, of pushing them to examine their own ideas more closely and to think more deeply about their convictions. This method is still widely used today in fields ranging from law to education, and even in modern-day business practices. In law schools, professors use the Socratic method to train students in logical reasoning and argumentation, honing their skills for future legal battles. They ask probing questions, forcing students to defend their positions and consider alternative viewpoints, thereby sharpening their analytical abilities. It's a challenging but effective way of developing critical thinking skills, encouraging students to become more thoughtful and reflective. In education more broadly, The Socratic method has inspired a whole approach to teaching, one that values dialogue over monologue. Instead of simply lecturing students, teachers engage them in dialogue, fostering a more interactive and engaging learning environment. Section 11. Reflections on the death of a sage. As we reflect on the death of Socrates, we are confronted with profound questions about justice, wisdom, and the nature of a good life. Was Socrates right to accept his death sentence? Could he have done more to defend himself? These questions have been debated for centuries, and they continue to challenge us today.